Hello there. Let's talk about switch. Now, switch has been in Java since the beginning. It was there in Java earlier as switch statements, but with JDK 14, even switch expressions were included, which means with JDK 14 and with every version that came after JDK 14, we had both switch statements and switch expressions. Now, you must be wondering that what is the difference between switch statements and switch expressions? So the difference is that like any other expression, even switch expression will evaluate to a value, but switch statements will not evaluate to a value. Now, in this video, we will focus our attention to switch statements only. And later, if there is a need or if you want me to, we will also talk about switch expressions. So with that said and done, let's get started with switch statements and let's take a look at the syntax of switch statement. Now, what you see over here is the syntax of switch statement. It has got a few elements and we're going to talk about all of these elements one by one. Now, as you can see, the switch statement starts with a switch keyword and it is followed by an expression. Now, this expression will evaluate to a certain value, and the type of value that the expression will evaluate to could be byte, short, int, char, or string. The expression can also evaluate two other types, for example, enumeration or object reference. But as we have not discussed that so far, let us conclude with the fact that the expression can resolve to either byte, short, int, char, or string. Now, let us say that the expression evaluates to int. And let's assume that it will evaluate to either 1, 2, 3, 4, and say all the way up to 10. And now what we want to do is we want to have a certain set of statements to evaluate if the value is 1, and a different set of statements for 2, for example, and another set for 3, another one for 4. And let's say for all of the values that it can evaluate to, be it from 5 to 10 or beyond, what we want to do is we want to have a common logic in place for this. So the question arises is, how do we do this with the help of switch? Now over here in the syntax, you can see that we have a switch keyword, right? But we also have a few other keywords, for example, case and break. And lastly, we have got the default as well. So let's say what you want to do is evaluate a certain set of statements if the value is 1. So what you will have to do is you'll have to say case 1, and then you'll have to put these set of statements over here. And then this will end with break. Similarly, for 2, what you will have to do is you'll have to say case 2, and of course, both of them will end with a colon, and you'll have to put the logic that you want to execute if the value is 2. And you'll do the same thing for 3 and 4. And lastly, for all of the values that the expression can evaluate to, you want to have a common logic, right? So what you can do is you can put that logic under default. So summarizing, what's going to happen is the expression will evaluate to a value, and we have assumed that the value will be of type int. Now, we've also assumed that the values would be 1, 2, 3, 4, and all the way up to 10, where we have specific set of statements to execute if the value is 1, 2, 3, and 4. And for all of the other values, that is from 5 to 10, we have a common logic. And to model this using switch, what we have done is made use of case. And what we have said is case 1, and then we have put the logic that we want to execute if the value is 1. We have done something similar for case 2, and we'll do the same thing for case 3 and 4. And for all of the values for which we have a common logic in place, I have made use of the default keyword. Now, one thing that you must have noticed is we have got a break after each case, but we don't have a break after default. And that is because it is not required. But I won't go into the details of break right away. What I'll do first is I'll write a simple Java code to demonstrate this. And then there are a few things in the syntax of switch which we are yet to discuss, which is what we will go for after we have taken an example. So let's open IntelliJ. And over here, I already have a package called selection statements, which we created in the last video when we were talking about if and its variations. Now here, what am I going to do is I'm going to create a Java class, and I'll name the Java class as switch example, and I'll have a main method. Now over here, what am I going to do is I'm going to take a single variable and we will name the variable as expression, and I'm going to take the type of variable as int. So I'll say int expression is equal to 1. Now, what am I going to do next is I'm going to say switch, and within a pair of parentheses, I'll say expression. And then I'll have a pair of curly braces, which will define the block associated to the switch statement. Now, inside the block, what am I going to do is, on the basis of our assumption that the values would be, say, 1, 2, 3, 4, and all the way up to 10, where I have specific logic for values 1, 2, 3, and 4, and common logic for values from 5 to 10 and beyond, I'll write the code. I will say case 1, and I'll end this with a colon because it is expected. And over here, I'll write the logic. The logic is pretty simple in our case. All that it will do is print 1. And we will end this with break. Then we will have case 2. And we will say system.out.println 2. We will end this with break. We will have case 3. And we will say system.out.println 3. End this with break. And we'll also have case 4. And we'll do the same thing. Say 4. Then end this with break. And lastly, we'll have default. Over here, we can say, for example, all other values. And we're not expected to end this with break. But if I put break over here, there won't be any errors. It's just that it is not required. And we will know in a moment why. For now, let me get rid of the break over here. And let's take a look at the code that we have written so far. So we've got a variable called expression, which is of type int. Now keep in mind that the variable expression need not be assigned 1 or any literal for that matter. It can be an expression actually, for example, a plus b by c or something like that. But just to keep the explanation and the example simple, I am hard coding this to 1. Now, assuming that expression evaluated to 1, what's going to happen next is the switch statement will be executed. Over here, we are saying switch 1. And when we say switch 1, what's going to happen is it is going to look for the cases and find the one where the value of case is 1, which is this one in our case. And once it finds that, what's going to happen next is it will evaluate the statements that are there inside the case. And in our case, it is printing 1 and then break. So if I run the code, what do I expect? I expect 1 as the output, right? So let's run the code and check. And that is what we got. If I change this to, for example, 4, what should I get? Well, we have a case 4, which is supposed to print 4, and that is what we got. If I change this to 14, for example, we don't have a case 14, right? But we do have default, and we know about default that the statements associated to default will get executed if all the cases that we have does not match the value that the expression evaluated to. So if I run the code, I should get all other values printed. And that is exactly what we got. So this is how switch statement works. Now, like I said, there are a few more things that we need to discuss. So let's discuss all of them one by one. Now, what did we discuss was the expression will evaluate to a certain value, and we concluded with the fact that it will evaluate to byte, short, int, char, and string. And like we know already, it can also evaluate to enumeration, for example, or object reference. But that's something we have not covered so far. So let's just stick to these types. Now, a very important point to note over here is that the type of value that the expression evaluates to and the case values that you put should match. Now, what do I mean by that is, we have taken an example where we have assumed that the expression will evaluate to an int value. So the case value that we give should be int. And if we don't do that, we will get an error. Let me demonstrate that with an example. Coming back to IntelliJ, let me just change the type of expression from int to byte. So far, so good. There's no error because expression, which is a byte variable, holds 14. And as we know, 14 lies within the range of values that byte can support. Also, the case values that we have used are 1, 2, 3, and 4. and 1, 2, 3, and 4 all lie within the range of byte, right? Now, what's going to happen if I have a case with a value that does not lie within the range of byte? Let's find out. Now, to recap, we know that the range of byte is -128 to 127, right? So if I say, for example, case 128, now 128 as the value of the case is not of byte type, but the expression that we have taken over here is of byte type. And that means there is a mismatch, which means compiler should give an error. So if I say case 128 and I say, for example, 128, wrong spelling, 28. As you can see, we are getting a red underline over here, but let's still run the code and read the error for ourselves. It says incompatible types, possible lossy conversion from int to byte. So what's happening over here? And by the way, this error is coming on line number 20, which is this. So what's happening over here is there is a mismatch. The expression evaluates to byte, but what we have done is we have taken int. And this error is the same that you will get when you do something like this. For example, let's say you've got a byte variable called, say, b, and you try to assign 128 to it. You'll get an error. And if you hover on this, it will say required type byte provided int. And if you still run the code, you should get an error in line number 5 itself. And that error should say the same thing, possible lossy conversion from int to byte. And this is happening in line number 5, which is this. So to conclude whatever we have discussed so far, the type of value that the expression evaluates to and the case value that we have taken should be compatible. So if I get rid of case 128, or if I don't get rid of case 128, I just change the type of expression to int. Now we see that the error has vanished. And if I change 14 to, for example, 128 and run the code, I should get 128 being printed, but it is getting printed along with this, which is all other values. And that brings me to another point. But before we get there, let us conclude this point, which is the type of value that the expression evaluates to and the case values should match. And if it matches, there will be no errors. But if it does not match, compiler will throw an error. Now, coming to the output that we are getting right now, which would have been the next point of discussion anyway, what's happening over here is it is first of all printing 128. I mean 128. And then it is printing all other values. Now, what you see happening over here is called fall through. And that happens when the break keyword is not there. Let me explain what's happening right now. So expression is assigned 128, right? And when it looks for the case which has got a value of 128, it will find this, correct? So it will print 128. Now, in the first example that we had taken, when the value of expression was 1, it printed 1, but then there was a break keyword, because of which it came out of the switch statements block, which means it came out of this block entirely over here. And this, by the way, is the end of the main method. And then the next one is the end of the class itself. So the program terminated. Not actually terminated, it just successfully completed. But over here, what's happening is if the case 128 is encountered, it will print 128 because that is what we are instructing it to do. But there is no break keyword. And because there is no break keyword, the control will not come out of the block of switch. It will go to the next line, and the next line is default, and it has got this statement, which is to print all other values. And that is why it printed 128 and it also printed all other values. So what does that mean? That means that if I get rid of break here, for example, and I change the value of expression to 1, what do you think would be the output? Pause for a moment and let me know the output in the comment. And now continuing, let's analyze the code. So the value of expression is 1. Now it will say switch expression. So switch 1, which means it will encounter case 1, which matches the value of expression, and it will print 1. But there's no break keyword, right? And the statement that immediately follows case 1 is case 2. But expression does not match 2. So this will not be executed. And for the same reason, this will not get executed. And for the same reason, this will also not get executed. And lastly, case 128 will also not be executed. And it will finally go to default and it will print all other values. And because this statement is the last statement in the block, the switch block will end, and then the main methods block will end, and then the class block will also end, and the program will successfully complete. So what we expect as the output is 1 and then all other values, right? Let's find out. And we got 1 and 2. So what exactly is going on? Let me explain. So the value of expression is 1, right? So it starts off with case 1 and it prints 1 because that's the only statement inside case 1. And then there's no break. So it goes on to the next statement, which is case 2. Now it will go to case 2 because it is not matching the value of expression to the values of case. It is just going for the next statement that it encounters on the way because all of these are sequential statements. So it will go for case 1 first. It will print 1. Then because there's no break, it will go to the next statement, which is case 2. And the statement inside case 2 is 2, right? So it will print 2 as well. And then it finally encounters the break keyword. And because there is a break keyword, what will happen is the control will come out of the block of switch, which means over here at the end of the main method and then finally at the end of the class, which is why we're getting 1 and 2 as the output when we run this code. And that means if I get rid of this break also and I run the code, I would get 1, 2, and 3, right? And again, if I get rid of, for example, this break and this break as well, that means we will have a switch statement without any break. And I have the expression assigned 1. What's going to happen? I'm going to get 1, 2, 3, 4, 128, and lastly, all other values as the output. So let's run the code and see. And that's exactly what is happening over here. And that also means if I change this to, for example, 4, what should I get? It will start from case 4. So it will print 4 first of all, and then 128, and then lastly, all other values. So if I run the code, that is exactly what we get. So updating our knowledge based on whatever we have discussed so far. That is, first of all, the expression will be evaluated. And on the basis of that expression, the switch statement will transfer the control to the relevant case. And if that case happens to be 4, for example, this is where the execution of statements will start. But if the case is 1, it will start from the first statement inside the switch body. So taking the example where the value of expression is 4, it will start from case 4. And because these are sequential statements, by the way, we know that there are sequential statements where the statements get executed one after the other. And then we have got selection statements, which is what we are going through right now. And the last video, we talked about another variation of selection statement, which is if. And then we have got iteration statements where we repeat a certain set of statements a certain number of times. So because these are sequential statements, that is statements that are supposed to be executed one after the other, what's going to happen is because it starts from case 4, the first statement inside case 4 will get executed. And because there is no break keyword, that is nothing forcing it out of the block of switch, it will move on to the next statement, which is just case 128. There's no matching being done over here. The matching of the value that the expression gave to the value in the case happens only once, and then the control gets dispatched to that particular case, after which the statements will get executed one after the other until it finds break or it reaches the end of the switch block. So if it gets case 4, it will print 4, then it will go to case 128, it will print 128, and finally it will go to default, print all other values, which will take it to the end of the switch block, then end of the main method block, and then finally end of the class. So with this, we've understood what the break keyword over here is used for and what will happen if that break keyword is not present. Now, there's another important point regarding the case values that I should be discussing. But before I do that, let me uncomment the break statements and let me put a break statement over here. Now, that important point which I was talking about is that the case values should not be duplicate. For example, if I have case 1 over here, I should not have another case 1 somewhere here or anywhere for that matter. Because if we have it, we will get an error. And you can see that there's a red underline over here and here. And if I still run the code, it will say duplicate case label. And this is self-explanatory, right? We've got duplicate cases. And the reason also is pretty obvious. That is, let's say expression evaluates to 1, right? Now, if expression evaluates to 1, what's going to happen is it will say switch to 1, and then it will start looking for the case where the value is 1, right? And it will then dispatch the control over there, which means that is where the execution of the code inside the switch body will start. But we've got 2. So how will compiler decide if it should dispatch the control here or here? And this ambiguity is not desirable, right? And that is why the compiler will give us an error, and then we will have to rectify it. That is, get rid of the duplicate case statements. And then if we run the code, it will work absolutely fine. Now, the break keyword is optional, which is something we already know, but the default that you see over here is also optional. So if I comment this out, you see that there are no errors, right? And if I run the code by taking, say, 4,000 as an example, which does not match any case over here, what do you expect would happen? Let's run the code and check. And as we can see, the program compiled and finished successfully, but there's nothing getting printed over here. And that is happening because the value of expression is 4,000, and 4,000 did not match with any of the case that we have. And there's no default either. And because it did not match with any of the case that we have, and there is no default, it did nothing. So that's what would happen if we don't have default. And that is not a problem, of course. You may or may not have it depending on the requirement. Also, let me demonstrate this. Let's say we have a statement after the block of switch. Let me just print after switch. So what's going to happen is this statement will be executed right after the block of switch ends. So if I run the code with 4,000, I get all other values because this time we have the default over here, and we also get after switch, and that's happening because there's a println statement after the switch block. But if I comment this out, what's going to happen? We're going to get only after switch as the output. So let me uncomment this and let's summarize everything that we have discussed so far. So far, what we have discussed is we've got a switch statement. And what happens in switch statement is it, of course, starts with the switch keyword. And then there's an expression that follows. And that expression will evaluate to a certain value. Now, what we can do next is we can put some cases inside the body of switch. And the values that we will assign to that case should match the type of expression that we have taken. For example, if the type of expression that we have taken is byte, the values cannot be int. So if we go for any number in between -128 to 127, it will work absolutely fine. But if we go for, say, 150, it won't, because the expression was byte and the range that it supports is -128 to 127, and the value that we have taken is 150. So there's a mismatch in the type. Then we'd also discussed that we have a break keyword, and then we also have default keyword, and both of these are optional. Now, if the break keyword is missing, what is going to happen is, first of all, the expression will dispatch the control to a certain case, and the execution of the statements will start from there. So, for example, if expression evaluates to 3, it will dispatch the control to case 3. So if there is a break keyword here or not will not matter, but if there is a break keyword after case 3 or not will matter, because the control was dispatched to case 3. So if there is a break keyword, it will execute the statements that are there in case 3, and then it will break, which means it will come out of the body of switch. And in our case, it will print after switch, and then the program will complete successfully. But if there is no break keyword, what's going to happen is it will print 3, and then it will go to the next statement, because in the absence of break keyword, the next statement is case 4. And then it will execute the statements inside case 4, which is to print 4. And then if it encounters break, it will stop. If it does not, it will keep on going unless it will either encounter a break or it reaches the end of the switch body. And then we had also discussed that default is optional. So if default is there, what's going to happen is if we have got the expression evaluating to a value for which there is no matching case, the body of default will get executed, which means it will handle all of the case for which no case label is defined. But if default is not there, and what happens is the expression evaluates to a value for which there is no explicit case over here, it will just not do anything. So this is what we have discussed so far. And by the way, like I said, the expression can be byte, short, int, char, and string. So if I say the expression can be int, for example, it does not necessarily mean that the case will only be positive. The case can also be negative. For example, over here, let me say case -1, and we can say -1. And let's end this with break, and let's put the expression as -1, and let's run the code. And we see we're getting -1 as the first line of output because of this. And lastly, we're getting after switch. So this means that you can have negative numbers. Another thing that you must have noticed is I have put the case labels in ascending order. Again, that is not a hard requirement. What you can do is you can put it in any order. For example, if I cut this, that is case -1, and I put it after case 3, for example, the output will not change. If I run the code, I'll still get -1, and then I'll get after switch. So the order in which the case is arranged is also not important. And that being said, I should also mention that even default need not be at the very end. What you can do is you can put it anywhere. For example, you can put it after case 1. And as you can see, there is no error. But the way the program will behave will change, of course. Let me demonstrate that to you. So if I say -1, what's going to happen? It will print -1, and that will be all, right? Now let me do this. Let me say, for example, -100. Now over here, expression is -100, but there's no case over here, which is -100. So what's going to happen is it will go to default. Since it goes to default, it will print all other values, right? But there's no break keyword over here. So what do you expect would happen? Well, let's run the program and find out. And as we run the program, we see we are getting all other values, which is something we expected, right? Because the value of expression is -100. And because of it, it will go to the default one. And it will print all other values. But there's no break keyword over there, which means it will also evaluate the next statement. And it will keep on doing that unless and until it either encounters a break keyword or it reaches the end of the switch block, right? So what's going to happen? It will print all other values. Then it will see there's no break keyword, right? So it will go to case 2. And over here, it will go for system.out.println 2, because of which we are getting 2 printed over here. And because there is a break keyword over here, what happened was the control came out of the body of switch and it landed over here, because of which it printed after switch. And that marked the end of the main method and finally the class. So, like I said, the order of case that you put inside the switch is not important, but you'll have to be careful as to what your program will give as the output. Now, if you want to avoid, for example, expression being -100, printing all other values and 2 also, you can put break. And then if you run the code, all you will get is all other values. And of course, after switch, because there's a statement which prints after switch after the block of switch ends. So like I said, there's no rule saying how you should order your case. And there's also no rule which says where the default should come. But by convention, because it is a good programming practice, because it makes it easier to read and understand the code, default is kept at the very end. And because default is kept at the very end, usually the break keyword is avoided because there's no need, right? Because after the statements associated to default executes, it will reach the end of the switch block. So having break over here will have no advantage. Also, the case are usually labeled in increasing order, or at least in an order which is easy to follow and understand. For example, if you have got int, it makes sense to have them either in increasing order or maybe even in decreasing order. Now let's take another example where what are we going to do is instead of having int as the type of the expression, we're going to take string as the type of the expression. So we will say switch using string example. And over here, we'll have a main method and we'll say string. Let's say the variable's name is expression here as well. And we'll say, for example, hello. And then we can say switch expression. Then we can say, for example, case hello. And we can print hello. And we can say break. And let's have another case. Let's say this is hi. And what are we going to do is we're going to print hi. And lastly, let's say we have got a default where what are we going to do is we're going to say bye. Oh, and I forgot to put break over here in the case hi. So now if I run the code, what do you expect as the output? You expect hello to be printed, right? So let's see if that's happening or not. And it is. Now, what if I change this to small h? That is, I still have hello, but then the one that I have is with small h, that is all lowercase letters. But the one that we have in case is not all lowercase. So if that is the case, what's going to happen? Well, we get pi because we've got hello with all lowercase and none of the case that we have over here matches this. So it goes to default and it prints by. So what can we conclude from this is strings can be used, which is something we had discussed already. But when we use string, we'll have to be careful about the case also. Now, all of the discussion that we had around switch might have told you that switch is a replacement of if, right? But there's a point of difference, and that is if works with Boolean values, where switch can work with byte, short, int, char, string, and of course, object references and enumeration. But both of these, that is switch and all of the variations of if, are used to dispatch the control of the program to a certain part of the code, depending on either condition, if you're using if and its variation, or the value that the expression evaluated to if you're using switch. So with this clear, let's talk about the next topic, and that is nested switch. And let's do this with the help of examples. And the first thing that I'm going to do is create a new class. And let's call the class nested switch example. And over here, we'll say public static void main. Now let's take a variable, say expression one, and let's put one over here. And what am I going to say is I'm going to say switch expression one. And since I have taken int, let's assume that the case values would be 1, 2, 3, and 4. So let's quickly put the case statements here. Now we've got one switch block, right? Now let's put another switch block in one of these cases. For example, let's say that in case 2, after I print 2, what I do is I go for another switch. So let's say I go for switch expression 2, for example. For that, I'll of course have to declare a variable over here saying expression 2. And let's assume that the values of expression 2 would be, say, 21, 22, 23, and 24. So what am I going to do here is I'm going to say expression 2 is equal to 21, and I'll comment all of these out. Now over here, we can have cases, right? So we can say case 21, and we can say s out 21, and then we'll say break. Then we'll say case 22, and we'll say 22, and we will break. Now let me put the other cases as well quickly. And let's not put default over here because it doesn't really matter and we already know how default is used. So we are fine by not putting it. Now, if I run the code with expression 1 is equal to 1 and expression 2 is equal to 21, what do we expect as the output? What we expect is it will print 1, and because there's a break right after that, it will come out of the body of switch. So that means we should get only 1 printed on the screen, right? So if we run the code, that's exactly what is happening. Now, if I change this to 2, what do we expect? Well, we've got case 2, which first of all prints 2, but there's another switch statement inside it. And it is working on the variable expression 2. And expression 2 has got a value 21. So what's going to happen is it will print 2 and then it will evaluate this. When it evaluates this, the value of expression 2 is 21, because of which it will print 21 also, and then it will break. So if I run the code now, I should get 2 and then 21 as the output. And that's exactly what we are getting over here. So this is how the nested switch works. But of course, there are more things to discuss over here. So let's discuss that one by one. Now, the first question that I have in my mind for you is, what if I change the value of expression 1 to 1? If I do that, we know what's going to happen. But what is going to happen if I comment this statement out? That is, we have case 1, we have case 1 printing 1, but there's no break keyword over here. And right after that, we've got case 2, and we also have switch statement inside case 2. And the switch statement inside case 2 works with the variable expression 2, which is assigned 21. So if I run this code, we expect what? 1, of course, because the expression 1 is assigned 1. So it will execute this. Then we also get 2 because the statement right after system.out.println 1 is case 2, because we don't have break, right? So it will print 2, and then after it printed 2, it gets inside the nested switch where it checks the value of expression 2, and the value of expression 2 is 21, because of which this case got executed and it printed 21 as well. Now over here, observe outer switch, that is this one, the main switch, has got cases 1, 2, 3, and so on. And the inner one has got cases 21, 22, 23, and 24. Now we know that the case label cannot be duplicated. For example, if I have case 1 over here, I cannot add another case 1 here, because that will give an error because there's a duplicate, right? But will the same thing hold for the inner switch? Well, let's find out. So we've got case 1 in the main switch, which is governed by expression 1 variable. Now in the nested switch, if I go for case 1, we see that we are getting no errors. And that is because each of these switch statements has defined their own blocks. There are no conflicts, even when you can see case 1 over here in the inner switch and case 1 over here in the outer switch. So this is all about nested switch. Now, because we have switch, which has its own block, everything that we have discussed about the scope and item of variables while we were talking about the variations of if holds true here as well. So if you have not watched that video out, I would highly recommend that you do. If not the entire video, at least the section of it where I'm talking about the scope and item of variables along with examples. You can find that video by clicking the card that is appearing over here and then checking the timestamp and going to the relevant section. So before we wrap up, let us solve a very simple question using switch. What we have to do is we have to take two numbers as input from the user. And we also have to take an operator as an input from the user. And to keep it simple, let's say the valid operator would be plus, minus, multiplication, and division. And let's also say that the numbers would be only integers. Now, what we have to do with all of this is, given the number and the operator, we have to use switch in order to find the result. That is, if let's say number 1 is say 2 and num2 is 3 and the operator is plus, the result would be 5. But if num1 is say 2 and num2 is 3 and the operator is multiplication, the result would be 6. Let us solve this using switch. So let's come to IntelliJ and let's create a new Java class and let's say simple calculator using switch. Now over here, let's have a public static void main and let's quickly have two variables. Now we are supposed to take input from the user, but to again keep it simple and because we already know how to take input from the user, let's hard code num1 to, for example, 10 and num2 to say 7. Then let's also have a variable called operator of char type and let's assign say division to it. Now what are we supposed to do next? We're supposed to have switch. And here we'll say switch operator, because what we want to do is have different logics in place depending on what the value of operator variable is. So we can say case plus, and over here we can say int result is equal to num1 plus num2, and we can print the result, right? And then we can end this with break. Now we can do something similar for minus, where what are we doing is we are saying num1 minus num2. By the way, this will give an error because we have got two variables with the same name in the same scope. So what are we going to say here is say sum, and over here let's say difference. Now the error vanished. Now let's continue and do this with multiplication, and we'll say product, and we'll say over here num1 asterisk, which is the symbol for multiplying, and we'll say system.out.println product. And lastly, we will say division, so case slash, and let's say quotient, and over here we'll say num1 by num2, and we will print quotient, and let's also include the remainder, right? So let's say modulus, and here we'll say int remainder, and we'll say num1 modulus or modulo num2, and we will print remainder. And we can also have a default where all that we will have to do is say invalid operator, because right now we only support plus, minus, multiplication, division, where we get the quotient, and another one where we get the remainder. So if I run the code with these set of inputs, what do we expect as the output? We've got 10 and 7, and we are dividing, that is collecting the remainder. And 10 and 7 are of int type. So we should get 1 as the output, right? So if I run the code, that is exactly what we get. If I change this to multiplication, I should get 70. Changing this to modulus, I should get 3. To minus, I should get 3 again. And if I say, for example, a comma, I should get invalid operator. So this is how we can have a very simple calculator using switch. So this brings us to the end of the video. Summarizing, we talked about switch. That's all, right? So I hope I've been able to teach you something new and useful. If you have any suggestions, feedback, or queries, feel free to put them in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.